Hey, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for engaging with session 2 of our Anti-Racism Professional Learning Enhanced series. This session today is going to be all surrounding introduction to privilege in the classroom. So just to give you a bit of an introduction to ourselves, myself, my name is Isabella James. I'm the director of I'm Representing IECC. My academic background, I've got a degree in politics and sociology. I also work as a policy and public affairs officer for a third sector organisation, as well as my director role. I've also got a bit of an educational background myself. I was a learning support worker for several years, and throughout that time I gained additional learning needs training and hands-on experience with children as well. And through IECC, I am an education policy and curriculum consultant as well. So I'll pass you over to my colleague Soraya, where she'll tell you a bit more about herself and IECC in general.
Thank you, Izzy. Okay, I'm Soraya Caudle. I'm the founding director of It's Mandatory CIC and I'm representing IECC. My background is youth and community education, of which I'm a qualified youth and community education officer. And I'm a mother of two, with 2 children with additional learning needs. And being the founding director of IECC, I'm also an education policy and curriculum consultant. So just to tell you a bit about who we are and what we do, first and foremost, IECC is taking tick box exercises off the agenda. We are not here to tick those boxes. We are very much about being proactive and making positive change. And the reason how we came about and why we're here is because of the lived experience of racism and discrimination within the education system and seeing the institutional racism basically that was having detrimental effects on so many young people. IECC was born. Basically, we provide bespoke and sustainable support to all education providers and workplaces across the following service areas. So we've got curriculum consultancy and delivery support, policy consultancy and innovation support, anti-racism professional learning and development programs, of which you're here today on one of those, inclusive learning resources, and also inclusive events management. So if you are interested in further understanding what we do and what we're about, you can always contact us on the information at the end of this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Soraya. Yeah, so just a bit of housekeeping for the session. If this was a live session, we'd be talking a bit about conduct and technicalities when it comes to technology. But for now, I think we'll focus a bit on IECC's values and principles. As you've seen in previous slide, IECC aims to take tick box exercises off the agenda. So just to keep in mind that this introductory session series is supposed to be alongside your continued professional learning, and it's just supposed to be the first step in your journey of embedding anti-racism into your school's culture and your personal values and conduct as well. So make sure that this just acts as part of your ongoing professional learning journey. As I say, this is just an introductory series. So if you did want to learn more about the full versions that we can provide related to this content, please do get in contact with us at the end of this session. Those details will be provided to you. So just to give some session aims to kind of direct our learning a bit in this session, first one would be to develop an understanding of the forms of privilege, and the second would be a bit more of a wider one, to be able to identify the presence / use of whitewash literature or resources and the ways in which educators can prevent delivery of biased material for an anti-racist agenda. So really feeding it back into our goals for an anti-racist Wales by 2030, our goals related to the new curriculum for 2022, and making sure we're doing all that we can to embed that anti-racism into our way of being. So first things first, let's start with defining some key terms. And obviously the kind of term that this session is revolved around is that term privilege. So to think about what does this privilege mean, and go about defining that. So the technical definition of privilege is defined as a right, immunity or benefit enjoyed by a particular person or a restricted group of people beyond the advantages of most. And if you may recognise this if you've attended our first session, that was all surrounding intersectionality and the ways that identity, disadvantage and different forms of being intersect to determine your experiences. The way you experience the world, the way you interact with others, the way the world experiences you. And just as disadvantages intersect, so do different forms of privilege. Just as disadvantages overlap to determine a person's experiences, opportunities and identity, types and forms of privilege do the same thing. So to extend on that point a bit, there's lots of different forms of privilege. It's not just white privilege that is often the key term and concept that we're often focusing on, but there's many different forms of privilege. There's gender privilege, there's socioeconomic privilege, religious privilege, racial privilege, and these many forms of privilege can interact to exacerbate one another as well. So there may be a person that actually is subject to all these different forms of privilege and reap the benefits of all of these different things. So to put this into a bit of social context and to apply this to a bit of reality, this video just really represents really well the process of realization when it comes to privilege, especially when it comes for children, that there's an inevitable moment where the concept and reality and consequences of privilege are brought to the forefront of children's mind and what that process looks like. So take a little look at this video and hopefully that enhances a bit of understanding there.
We are going to be running a race. However, your starting position in this race will be decided by the answers to questions that we are going to be asking you.
Sorry, what? It's a joke.
This activity is intended to explore how society favours one race over others.
People often confuse white privilege with being wealthy or being rich, and it isn't about that. What it's about is the absence of having to live with the consequences of racism.
Now, if the question applies to you, you will take a big step forward. If the answer to the question doesn't apply to you, you stay where you are.
I better win, man. Oh.
Okay, make sure you're on the start line. I see some cheaters already.
Yeah, fine.
Feet behind the line.
If English is your parents' first language, take a step forward.
Oh, yeah.
If you have ever been the only person in the room of your race, take a step backwards.
For God's sake!
If you've never been asked where you come from, take a step forward.
If you have never had to be worried about your family being stopped and searched, take a step forward.
I don't get worried about if people ask me to stop and search.
The divide widens, and the inequality of their position becomes clear.
This is just like not fair now. Farah, none of us are white. None of us are white. It's unfair.
The last question. If your parents have ever warned you about racism, take a step backwards.
If we were about to start a race, is this a fair starting point for us all? No. Mackay, how do you feel standing there in the field of runners?
I kind of feel a bit alone. I can't really see it. I'm literally just by myself, more or less. I'm just a bit frustrated and annoyed that society nowadays really isn't fair. And I just wish everybody could be equal.
Farah!
It's kind of frustrating that, like, me and Sarah are just standing at the back here while the majority of people who may be white are, like, standing right at the front. That just frustrates me a bit, because it's almost as in what society is today. I don't want this to be how it is, but it is, so it just gets a bit frustrating.
Henry, how are you feeling being right at the very front?
feels quite weird because if you think about it, I think all of us should be at the same point, but sadly the questions, the way that they were put didn't favour some people, which I think is quite unfair.
So hopefully I think that simplified a little bit the concept of privilege, but also given a representation of how often that process of realisation plays out for a lot of young people, and how actually hard-hitting and sad that can be as a realisation for a lot of people, that there is differences there and that they can't be avoided. So I think it's important as well to define the difference between equity and versus that with equality. So I think if we were to strip it back to that simple almost metaphor that children were using in terms of a race, a starting point in a race, I think when it comes to equality, we're all reaching for that end goal of ending up in the same position and making sure that we're on a level playing field as equal people. But we also have to think about the head starts that people have been given in that race, and thinking about how the methods to mitigate those things also equal the start in life that we're given as well. And part of that is making an equitable environment, equitable resources. And so the definition of equity relates just to that, the quality of being fair and impartial. And fairness often has a distinction over being equal, because sometimes to be fair, you have to be unequal in your distribution of resources. It recognises each person has different circumstances and needs, and therefore different groups of people need different resources and opportunities allocated to them in order to thrive. So, all well and good offering the same opportunities to be able to achieve something or thrive, but we need to make sure that people have the route to those opportunities there and can access these opportunities with the same ease as a different person. And putting that into a systemic context as well, anti-racism requires action, and that's distinct over non-racism, and that's a key theme for anti-racism. So part of that, if you're truly dedicated to making an inclusive, equitable, more socially just world and institution, you must explicitly act to address the systems that are inequitable. So really important to understand that definition of equity, and how it's distinct from equality in that way. So to bring it back to the theme of the session as a whole, privilege in the context of the classroom, we're going to go into some more, some branches really of the theme itself. So teaching fiction in particular. A quote here says, a study commissioned by the Book Trust found that in 2017, less than 2% of children's books were written by British people of colour. The lack of diversity of published children's literature means that children are generally only exposed to books by and about white people. Hence, the importance of teaching books by people of colour in the education system is paramount, as it may be the only place that children are exposed to these authors. So there's some privilege in quite a few areas there. It's the privilege that we relate to children being able to see themselves in the content that they're learning about, the books that they read, the images that they see, where they can see themselves in those images, and with that can be imaginative and feed on that empowerment and progress and develop with that. And on the flip side of that, the disadvantage of children not being able to see themselves in those spaces, not just the content of the books themselves and the literature and resources themselves, but also the people behind those resources and literature, that they too, the authors of these and creators of these resources, also don't relate to these children and their experiences, the way they identify and the way they look. And that can have a really massive impact on the development and the flourishing of a child in general. So to build on that, and to go a bit more into the impact of what this has on children, we'll just watch a quick video about the doll test, which really sums up and exemplifies what the mental impact and emotional impact this can have on children.
Quale bambola è bianca? Quale bambola è nera? Quale delle due è bella?
Questa.
Qual è quella bella? Qual è quella brutta? E qual è quella buona? Quale è cattiva? Qual è buona?
Lei.
Perché è buona?
Perché ha gli occhi celesti.
Quale è cattiva? Perché è cattiva?
Perché è tutto nero.
E qual è la bambola che ti somiglia di più?
So that video really just gives a good representation, again, of the impact that this can have on children, of not only not seeing yourself in particular spaces, but the images that you do see are of very biased and mainstreamed, you know, very white spaces, and so, you know, the impact of that can have on a child's development, and in the video in particular, it's clear that you can see kind of the cogs turning in the children's minds of, you know, the reasons, you know, why that they're feeling that these negative connotations with these images of dolls, and then that realization that the dolls relate most to them and look most like them, the psychological impact and kind of clue that has between the negative feelings of self-perception and realization, that is really detrimental to a child's development, and has a massive impact on the extent to children feel empowered and confident and you know, imaginative and ready to develop. So to go into touching on teaching non-fiction as opposed to fiction, there's many different areas that can be influenced, especially when it comes to teaching non-fiction, when we get into the subject areas, the factual things, especially when it comes to history. There's lots of different types of bias that can be involved in not only the content itself, but also the delivery of factual content for learners to absorb. A key term that I think is being used a lot more in the 21st century is the concept of tokenism, and it's something that people are becoming more aware of the meaning of, but something that is probably a really good example to identify where tokenism is, and the language of tokenism is probably used a lot more, is the month of Black History Month, where actually that can be seen as a token investment in the bigger picture of an anti-racist agenda, as opposed to Black History 365, which relates more closely to the purpose of embedding anti-racism into a culture where Black history, of course, is vital every day, not just for a month, and it's entrenched in everything you do as an educational institution. And it's reflected clearly in the way that you teach and design content. But today we're going to focus on two key terms when it comes to teaching non-fiction, and privilege and bias association entrenched there. So whitewashing and Eurocentrism are those key terms that we'll be focusing on. So a fact that I'm guessing many people won't be aware of is the fact that an estimated 2.5 million Indians served in the Second World War, and over 1.3 million Africans served in the First World War. It's more than often overlooked and quite frankly dismissed. In the making of Britain, the non-white comes to believe they played no part. When this ignorance mobilises itself into white supremacy, we find ourselves having created an ill-informed and failed system of education. So the fact that actually people of all different descents and regions and nationalities and cultures had a massive part to play in the biggest events of our history, the fact that this isn't a widespread notion, that it's not often taught when it comes to history classes, actually has a massive impact on the way that not only children of colour view themselves in the part that they play or they feel that they play in their own history, but also the way that children who aren't children of colour also see themselves in the part that they play, that they have in history, where actually that part doesn't include people of differing identities, regions, cultures, and how inaccurate this is, and that this is a detrimental thing to be influencing the learning of children, that our history, unfortunately, oftentimes isn't accurately represented, and this can have a massive impact on the development of children. To extend that point as well, and to kind of put a bit more of a definition onto whitewashing, the issue boils down to minorities finding themselves painted out of the picture, in danger of becoming ignorant to the history of their forefathers. So as a good example of that as well would be the movie Hidden Figures, which was one of those mitigation methods that attempt to kind of bridge the gap between those gaps found in history, where people of different cultures, backgrounds, identities have inevitably been written out, not to be studied or identified by learners in the future. And of course, Hidden Figures is a great representation of that, if you have seen that, and the way that these women of colour were written out of history when it comes to the history of NASA. So to move on to obviously a bit more of a technical term when it comes to Eurocentrism, being Eurocentric means focusing on European culture or history and regarding it as more important than the culture or history of other regions. So thinking about, in your own learning, and I suppose in the learning that you're reflecting or you're teaching on to your learners, how representative is that history? Is there a kind of disproportionate focus on what is classed as European culture? And is that teaching of that European culture itself, is that biased in its own right? Are we focusing on certain groups or demographics of people over others? Thinking about lots of teaching in history on royal families, monarchs, does that dominate your history lessons? When we're thinking about decades and decades ago, or centuries ago, to the Greek times of the Greek, are we talking about or analysing whether this content is biased, or whether actually other regions or people had parts to play in this history? And are we making sure that this approach isn't biased and can't be classed as Eurocentric, and that we're appreciating every single contribution of cultural history that inevitably creeps into our history too? Are we reflecting that in our lessons, what we say to our learners, and how we go about delivering that? And to touch on a bit about, again, the impact that this can have going into adulthood, a quote from an individual that's now 22 recalls how everything they learned in their history lessons was about white Britain. They recall it was like Black Britain didn't count. And now aged 22, I'm struggling with why wasn't I given the opportunity to learn about my Black heritage and my Black culture and my Black history? Am I not as British as the people I sat in class with? Why is only half of my culture being taught? I would ask myself this every time I sat down in our history lessons. Teaching accurate history won't only be beneficial for Black and minority ethnic children, it will be beneficial for white children. So I think this quote there actually goes into both sides of the coin that we're looking at. It goes into whitewashing and it also goes into Eurocentrism. It goes into what types of heritage are we teaching and is that Europe-centred, but it also goes into the assumption that Black Britain doesn't feed into the history of Britain as a whole, and that the history of Britain is white Britain, and it's exclusive of other races, and that misconception needs to be stomped out and addressed. So there's two really important factors that are covered there, and we can see the impact is extended and it's long term.